Good evening and welcome everyone to the MSO Classroom Live Online session for VCE Music Exam Preparation. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, as well as extend a warm welcome to any First Peoples who may be in attendance. Tonight, though we come together from many different places, we recognise that the MSO's home is on Boonwurrung land. My name is Sylvia Hosking and I'm the school's program manager at the MSO, and I'm really excited to see you all here for this important and timely session with really inspiring presenters who I know you'll learn a lot from. To make the most of this unique opportunity, I really invite you to take part tonight in a proactive way, so please respond and interact with our presenters in the chat. And also use the chat for any relevant musical commentary you might have. This may include any advice that you've received from your own teachers that you've found particularly helpful and would like to share with other students here tonight. Our presenters are a rich blend of musicians and educators with many years of experience and knowledge to share with you. What you'll learn and take with you tonight will be beneficial for you in the exam period to come, but of course, and also more importantly, it will benefit you well beyond that small moment in your lives. Nicholas Bochner, or Nick as we know him, is Assistant Principal Cello with the MSO, as well as the Cybec Assistant Conductor for Learning and Engagement. He's been involved in developing and conducting MSO's education events after extensive research and study in both London and Australia, with some of the greatest exponents of music and music education, including the late Richard Gill and Benjamin Northey. James Lefevre holds a Bachelor of Music with Honours from the Australian National University, majoring in jazz saxophone, and education qualifications from Monash University. He's an incredibly passionate and enthusiastic musician and educator. Currently, the head of music at the Victorian College of the Arts Secondary School, he served previously at Our Lady of Sion College, and he continues to perform regularly, as well as to present to students and teachers alike, and conduct as well. James proudly serves as the immediate past National President and Vice President of Victoria in the Australian Band and Orchestra Directors Association. Over to you, James.
Thanks so much, Sylvia. I'm really chuffed to have been invited to come in and work with the marvellous MSO and help guide some VC exam preparations, which of course are just weeks away. But more than this, hopefully everybody walks away with some ideas to think about and apply to their own music making. Our first section of tonight's session is going to focus on developing an authentic interpretation with a sense of personal expression whilst still adhering to the stylistic conventions of the period. Of course, this is super important for all of you about to present a program for your externally assessed performance exams, whether you're doing VCE Music Investigation or VCE Music Performance. And whilst tonight we're going to be tackling this topic through a classical lens, for all of our contemporary musicians out there, the concepts really are exactly the same. And now I'm sure that you're all very familiar with the assessment criteria, and your teachers have been asking you to hone your performances based on all 10 of those criteria. But there is always a balancing act in the criteria between presenting an historically informed interpretation and performing with creativity and individuality. Now, this is something that professional musicians grapple with all of the time. How do I embrace the composer's intention and pay homage to the music of their time? But at the same time, how do I say something relevant to today and authentic and personal in the music? And Nick, this is where we're going to bring you in. You've been playing new and old music with the MSO for more than 22 years, as well as performing in solo and chamber settings. So I'd love to draw on your experience here. How do you balance being stylistically appropriate and finding room for your own voice?
Well, James, you really are asking one of the big questions right there. It's a lifelong journey actually finding out how to balance that thing. It's kind of the big question that means you become a musician that people want to listen to. So sometimes it's hard to make that transition, but there are things that you can do, and I'm sure you are all doing a lot of them right now. One of the obvious things is you learn from your experience with others. Your teachers will be telling you all sorts of things that'll be really useful for learning how to do this. Learning from your peers as well, watching how people around you perform music. You can learn so much from them. And of course, you have to do a lot of work by yourself. So whether that's practicing your piece of music or actually doing a bit of research and looking into the music. So you can look at the background that surrounds it. And this is the thing that I've been finding lately, is so much of what we need to know about a piece of music is actually in the very music itself, in the notes and how the thing is put together.
All right, Nick, you've mentioned research has been a bit of an important factor. Let's start there. I believe you've kind of put it together a bit of an example of some research that you've completed recently looking at Beethoven's Seventh Symphony.
Well, that's right. The very last performance that MSO did before we were shut down, where we were able to have a full-size orchestra, was a performance of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. And so we've used that a little bit this year for engaging new audiences and talking about music. And it really is a fantastic example of how you can find a guide to the piece of music inside the music itself. And now, as James said, even though we're looking at a symphony by a 19th century German composer, this principle applies to all of the music that is worth playing, all of the music that you're going to spend your time with. It's great music somehow. So whether we're talking about a song by the Beatles or a classic John Coltrane number, or indeed a Beethoven symphony, there's going to be some sort of internal logic of construction, and you can use that to guide your interpretation. Let's have a little bit of a closer look at Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. So one of the reasons why Beethoven is so interesting to study is he was sort of more than any other composer before him. He really wanted to create something even bigger and more important. He wanted to make music that was somehow the embodiment of a moral vision or a depiction of the state of humankind and a sort of guide to the spiritual aspirations available to us. It's a big ambition. But how can you do that? Something so spiritual and philosophical, just using the sorts of sounds we make with musical instruments. Well, one of the keys to that is Beethoven's early musical training. It put him in direct contact with J.S. Bach, Mozart, and Haydn. And from these three, he inherited this really highly developed contrapuntal and classical style. And that's already governed by its own very clear logic. Now, Beethoven's genius lay in his ability to take this logic and he'd carry it to the point where each work that he created set up a musical premise, and that would set in train a series of logical results so compelling that as a listener, you feel as though you're inhabiting a reality in which sounds are facts, and the combination, the contrasting, resolution and culmination of these sounds are actual events. So the resulting music has a character much more of a sort of the discovery of a natural phenomenon than that of a human creation. Now, as I said, it's a musical logic. And so by definition, we can't really describe that in words. But if we take a bit of a closer look at just a part of it, we can try and work out what's going on. So for Beethoven, the first step in creating this world in sound that he wanted to make, he would set out the parameters of that world right at the beginning of every symphony. Sometimes, as in the Fifth Symphony, he sets this up immediately within the first few bars. Everyone knows this. And then everything follows on from that. Now, in contrast to that, the Seventh Symphony has the longest introduction of all of his symphonies, and this allows him to set up a framework of musical parameters that will govern the entire work. Let's have a listen to the first 10 bars. So the first thing that happens there is we get this full orchestra chord and it tells us what key we're in. This is A major. So then after this very full sound, there's this solitary oboe and it presents a phrase of perfect symmetry. It's a falling fourth and a rising fourth with equal rhythmic values. Then the second chord strike arrives, and that again leaves us with a single note, but that quickly splits into two lines. And then the next big chord leaves us with three lines, and the chord after that leaves us with 4. So that's one level of development of this phrase. At the same time as this accumulation of instruments, we have an accretion of rhythmic values. So the first 2 bars are 4 equal note values, and then the next 2 split the second bar into some faster notes, crotchet, 2 quavers, and then the following 2 bars split the second bar still further. And so there are 2 more processes at work here that we don't necessarily notice consciously, as our ear is naturally drawn by those beautiful wind lines, but they are things that enter our subconscious and they shape our understanding and expectations of the whole rest of the work, not just the first movement, but all 4 across the entire symphony. So the first thing that we don't necessarily notice, but it's really important, is that there's a bass line under these full orchestra chords, and this line is descending by half steps or a chromatic scale. I think we might be just one page behind with our PDF examples, or maybe if you just want, that's the one. So you can see that descending bass line there. So that's one of the important things. It kind of is, we may not hear, but it becomes important. And the second one is that through each of these phrases, as the wind instruments build up, we get these single notes that are held through the harmony. And this focus on a single static note is something that returns in every movement of the piece. Now, to describe a compositional process as being governed by a musical logic, it might suggest somehow that the unfolding of the music could be in some way predictable or obvious, but on the contrary, it's this musical logic that allows something surprising and breathtaking that no one else would have thought of to make complete sense once we hear it. So, following this opening phrase, this musical logic demands that something very different happen. We've had an unbroken line of 9 bars with sustained notes, and these are moving over intervals of a 4th and a 5th. And then we get a single bar of fast notes, and they're rising by step against a static note in the bass. This single bar is answered by a bar that is a version of the very first bar of the piece, and somehow we sense that these 2 apparently disjointed ideas are connected. So you remember how we talked about this process of rhythmic accretion? We have minims and then crotchets and quavers and then quavers. So the rhythmic values of this rising scale, they're the next step in that rhythmic process. And of course, there's this static note in the bass, and that relates to the held notes that we heard in the upper winds in the first phrase. Then Beethoven combines a repeat of the opening phrase with this rising scale, and the effect is like a revelation of truth. And we're only in the 15th bar of the whole work. So we have this web of compelling logic, and it operates at every level of a work of true genius like this. The logic spans across phrases, sections, and movements, and it brings the whole work together. It's this that creates a sense of an organic unity, because it works really exactly like DNA in a natural system. Every note and every phrase contains the genesis of the rest of the piece. Now, while the introduction's compelling logic sets the whole work up for us, it does so while concealing a very big surprise. Now, I find it hard to imagine never having heard this piece before, but in a way, if you haven't heard this before, you're quite lucky, because this sweep and majesty and nobility of the introduction, it doesn't prepare you for the substance of the main movement. At the end of the introduction, having introduced a wealth of material, Beethoven narrows his focus to two things: the single repeating note and the process of rhythmic development. And now we find out what the Seventh Symphony is really about. It's a celebration of rhythm and dance. And now this gives us another important area to explore excuse me, when searching for authentic interpretation, finding the source of the ideas. Composers and musicians rarely create musical material out of thin air. Rather, they've been steeped in music for their whole lives, and this music inevitably finds its way, sometimes consciously and sometimes not, into their creations. In the case of the Seventh Symphony, there's a driving dotted rhythm theme, and it forms a basis of the main part of this movement, and it has its origins in the folk music of Scotland and Ireland. Now, this may seem like an unlikely source for a composer who is seen as so relentlessly serious and thoroughly German, but in terms of minutes of music composed, one of the largest single genres of music by Beethoven was his arrangements and settings of Irish and Scottish songs that he undertook primarily as a source of income. So if you listen to this, you'll discover how in his hands, this lilting dotted Scottish rhythm, it becomes the prime driving force of a powerful musical construction. So that's a bit of the first movement. We could go on all night examining how all that's put together. There's so much in it. Let's have a quick look at the second movement of this symphony, because it's among the best loved and well-known of Beethoven's music. It's been used in one or two very famous films, and it comes in probably just behind his Ode to Joy and the first movement of the Fifth Symphony in popularity. The enormous appeal of this movement can be a bit hard to explain. It starts, like the main part of the first movement, with a compelling rhythm, and this one, it's recognisable as a pavan or a slow march. The first half of the phrase of this movement holds us with a single note melody, which again harks back to those held notes in the introduction of the first movement. And then the second half of the phrase answers this, and it recalls the descending chromatic line of the introduction. If you remember that, we had a descending chromatic line in the bass. Here it's in the middle parts, and it leads to this heartbreaking major-minor resolution of this phrase. And then the movement proceeds as a set of variations on this first idea. And here Beethoven gives us a masterful demonstration of how to layer instrumental timbre and texture to delineate form. He starts with the very dark sound of the low strings, and he gradually builds up to a powerful statement of the march with the full orchestra.
Thanks so much for your insights, Nick. It's pretty incredible how much knowledge you have of this piece and of the style. So I guess I'd love to know more about how you translate this knowledge that you've developed through your study of this work into performance. Because after all, that's what all of our Unit 4 investigation and performance students are working towards. So maybe could you share some of your insights into how this all works inside of an orchestra? You've got this knowledge, but how do you translate that into performance terms?
Sure, that's a very good question. Well, from the point of view of the conductor, and this is the same for any interpreter, obviously a conductor is just controlling the interpretation of a whole group of musicians. If you're doing this by yourself, you're basically your own conductor. So what they're concerned with is this unity. Idea of unity is really, really important across all of the arts, whether it's a film, a book, a painting, or a big piece of music. It works for people if there is some kind of sense that the whole thing belongs together. And so when you've got a piece of music that's more than a couple of minutes long, the idea of creating a thread all the way through it's really important. And to do that, you really need to know how the thing is put together. Like the way I've just gone through with the Beethoven, and we've seen the various phrases and ideas, the motifs, how they are developed, how they relate back. And just by having that understanding of the construction, you will immediately begin to play with meaning, because you'll understand how to play this bit here because it relates back to that bit there. So that's how the conductor uses it, and it's the same as a member of the orchestra. You need to contribute that same kind of understanding when you've got those phrases, and when the conductor wants something from you, you need to have some clue about what's going on and what they're wanting. Yeah.
Excellent. And I remember we were preparing for this presentation, and we had a bit of a moment where we were talking about the importance of having that really clear sense of intention in your phrasing, with a clear sense of direction in behind what you're putting together. And, I've been teaching VC music for 10 years or so, and it's probably the biggest thing I've heard, along with the quality of sound that the student creates, that the thing that sets aside an A-grade performance from a B-grade performance is really the sense of phrase throughout the work. The strongest performances sound like they've really considered the function of each individual note within a phrase, and then they're able to control the shaping of each of those notes to always maintain that sense of musical direction. But more than that, they've also understood the purpose of each phrase within the structure of each section, and they've got that really clear bird's eye view of the overall roadmap of the piece of music that you were talking about. So Nick, I wonder if maybe you could grab your conveniently located cello that you've hopefully got just beside you, and maybe you could demonstrate some of the different approaches to the way that you might be able to phrase that iconic opening of the second movement from Beethoven 7.
Sure, it's actually really interesting, even though it's so simple. There are lots of options, and let's just look at there are two ways of doing that opening. Now, the way we've just heard Ben Northey do it, he thinks very much. I think he's thinking of the dance of it, and he's thinking of the way it swings through two bars. So as you're saying, the idea of shaping a phrase. One of the things we often talk about in the orchestra, you'll hear people asking each other and asking the conductor, do you want that phrase to go towards the second bar or away from? And this is something we spend a lot of time on because it's so important. So what Ben's decided with that phrase, he's playing it very much emphasizing the first bar and moving away, and then emphasizing the third bar. So you end up with. Whereas another quite valid interpretation, and I think it's one that I would lean to, is I'm thinking about the harmony that's underneath. So as I'm going to play towards the second bar, because the harmony moves towards there, and then I'm going to play from bar 3 to 4. So I'm going to play I played the viola line there. I'm going to play the cello line this time. That way, it allows me to do 3 times towards the second bar of the cell, but the 4th time I go from the first and away, and then that gives me a sort of a 4-bar shape. Both of those ways of doing it are equally valid, and they both work. And they're both informed by what's actually in the music. We're not just sort of making things up. One emphasizes the dance taking from the pavan, and the other one's thinking about the harmony.
I think it's pretty incredible that you can do pretty much the opposite thing there, and it has such an amazing impact on the character, and the fact that, you know, there's no rights and wrongs really. There's informed, but there's multiple ways to end up at your answer, and that's really what it comes down to, I think, in developing your own authentic interpretation, is doing that research and then being able to apply that in performance. And you know, we've spoken about the dynamic shaping of that opening passage, but what about the note length? There's some interesting kind of options happening with the note length. I saw that there was some staccato marks and some slurs with staccatos, and obviously staccato means something different in all sorts of different contexts. So tell us about that.
Well, that's right. It's, you know, a staccato dot can mean everything from being incredibly short to being just slightly detached. And again, how do we decide to do that? So going back to these two different ways of doing it, where Ben wants us to emphasize the first and move away, you generally end up with slightly shorter staccatos in the first bar. So it would be like this. Whereas when you're working towards the second bar to emphasize the harmony, those staccatos become a bit longer because you need to lengthen to create that direction. So once again, we end up with something that's quite different, and we're just finding a way. Well, it says a staccato dot, but what's the context? And that's what can give us an idea of how to actually interpret it. But again, you need to have some fairly, you know, concrete and compelling reason. Otherwise, I mean, you could do anything, but it has to make sense, really.
Yeah, of course it has to make sense. That's kind of what we're aiming for with our research. And look, there's obviously all sorts of other things that you can experiment with, the tempo and the use of rubato, if you use rubato, or how much rubato you use. And obviously all sorts of different conversations would happen in the orchestra about tone color and the sound that you're creating on the instrument. And we're going to come back to that a little bit later on. But one of the other things that really fascinated me in our conversations was the notion of remaining authentic and in the moment, even though you're aiming for this highly refined and super polished, precise performance. So how do you go about balancing that quest for perfection and also maintaining a sense of spontaneity in the music?
Well, I'm going to give you some really good advice first up, and that is just let go of the idea of perfection. You know, one of the amazing things about working in MSO is we often get to work with people who are at the absolute peak of their profession internationally. We're talking the really, really top people. And what I think really, you know, is distinctive about them is not that they never make mistakes, it's what they do when they make a mistake. You rarely see a perfect performance, but the way someone can handle something slightly out of the ordinary happening and just gliding, either use it or ignore it or keep going. So let go of perfectionism for a start. And then the second thing about being in the moment and about perfection, obviously you've presumably been working really hard all year on your performance. So you have to begin to trust yourself that that work has been useful. And so you can start to exist in your ears. You know, when you come out to perform, the most important thing to do is to remember to keep listening, whether it's to yourself. You can try and listen to what your sound is like in the hall to take your ears away from you. If you're playing with other people, that's an absolute gift. And you just listen, listen, listen. And that by definition keeps you in the moment because you're going to hear things and you'll respond to them. And then there's things, of course, like if you know the sort of structural stuff we've been talking about with the Beethoven that applies to everything. If you understand the bigger roadmap of your piece and you understand the underlying harmonic structure, then it makes you sort of, you know where you're going in this bigger picture. And it's as though you know the shape of a story and you could tell it in your own words. You just happen to be using these words that are there for you. So there are just a couple of things that I think are useful.
And I think you sort of touched on it, but knowing the accompaniment is so essential. And you can hear the difference when a student knows their part, and they might know their part really well inside out and have really great concept of how they're going to approach the work. But when they go away and do that work and get to know the accompaniment deeply and analyze that, it takes it to a whole nother level. And I guess just a quick tip that I've got here that I've discovered can be really helpful when you are going into that performance and the mind starts rushing with ideas and all the body sensations are happening and we're a bit nervous and the sweaty hands and the breathing and all those sorts of things go. I think having a couple of character words to come back to for each of your pieces, just to narrow the focus in, can be really, really beneficial. So, you know, you might have a piece of music where you're just trying to keep it light and buoyant. And if you have that in your mind, that, you know, just light and buoyant, and let the other things just take care of themselves, that can often be a really great thing to help you just focus on a few elements rather than being overwhelmed by everything that's happening. With that, preparing for performance, you've obviously got a few gigs under the belt, and have played some pretty big gigs and auditions and those sorts of things. What other tips can you share with our audience about how to prepare for those big occasions?
Well, I think probably one thing that's really important to realize is that you can't practice performing in any other situation except performing. And that's really tricky for most of us. We don't get that many performance opportunities, so you have to create them. And I certainly find that as soon as there's one person listening to me, it changes everything. It becomes like a performance. So you've got to find your friends, your family, anyone who'll sit down for long enough to listen to either one part of your program or the whole thing, and play it through and play it through and play it through. For some of us, pressing the record button on some sort of recording device can create the same sort of experience. You don't want to get too obsessed with recording, but it can be really useful. And then the other thing that I think is really important for an inexperienced performer is don't try and kid yourself that you won't be able to be relaxed out there. So don't tell yourself, I'm not going to worry, I'll be fine, I'll be relaxed, it'll be fine, because you'll probably find yourself out there you won't be. You need to understand what sort of performer you are and be honest with yourself, and then visualize how it's going to feel. So if you know what the room looks like that you're going to go into, that's great, because you can do really good visualizations. You close your eyes, you picture yourself with your instrument walking through the door, the people say hello or whatever, you sit down and you go through the whole thing mentally so that you won't be freaked out when you're doing it in real life. Just a couple of things there.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing your experience, Nick. And before we move on to the next topic for tonight, we just want to wish everybody presenting performances at the end of your exams all the very, very best. It's been a pretty wild ride through 2020 so far, and I think you can give yourselves a really big pat on the back for having worked through something that no other cohort of students has ever had to do before. And whilst you're probably feeling an array of emotions, nervous, trepidation, excited, probably relief that it'll soon all be over, I really do encourage you to try and slow down and enjoy the experience. It is just one performance, and it doesn't define you. And at the end of the day, you don't actually have any real control over your grades. All you have control over is how you prepare and your mindset going into the exam, and then, of course, your mindset coming out of the exam. So just try to do your best in the circumstance. It's all you can ever expect of yourself. And remember that making great music is a lifelong pursuit. And there's a quote that I quite often refer back to, and it goes like this. The only musician you should ever worry about being better than is the one that you were yesterday. So I think we're going to take a short break right now. So everybody, I encourage you to stand up, have a stretch, and enjoy a little musical excerpt here from the MSO Brass and Percussion performing New Nausea, which was composed by Peter Sculthorpe. And we'll be back in about 2 minutes. Well, welcome back. We're going to move on to discussing something that's on both the styles and composition and also the music performance end of year exam, which of course is listening responses, where you hear a piece of music that you've never heard and you're asked to respond to questions about that piece of music. The requirements of each of the VCE study designs varies a little bit, but the common ground is the discussion of how the elements of music create character in the music. So music performance will focus on the expressive elements that the artist has control over, things like tempo and dynamics, tone to color, articulation, phrasing, blend of instrumental voices, balance of music lines, and then improvisation, embellishment, and ornamentation. Whereas music style and composition will focus on all of these elements and a few others, but also the three compositional devices of repetition, variation, and contrast. But for the full list of elements and a very brief definition, you should definitely head to the 2020 study design for music. Make sure it's the adjusted 2020 study design for VCE music and check out page 13. There's lots of useful information in and around page 13. But for now, let's just focus on some of the elements that the exam papers both have in common. So a moment ago, we heard the sensational brass and percussion from the MSO perform Peter Sculthorpe's New Nausea. In a moment, we're going to have a listen again and focus on the player's approach to tone color and phrasing. So when we write about tone color, sometimes referred to timbre, of course, we're essentially trying to describe the sound of the instrument in words so that somebody else might be able to imagine what it sounds like. We could, of course, talk about each instrument by itself, but we could also discuss the blend of tone colors of different instruments or groups of instruments together. So when discussing the blend of tone color, it's a really good strategy to make sure that you write about the instruments that sound similar or homogeneous, and then highlight the instruments that have contrasting tone color. And it's essential, of course, that we use 2 or 3 words to describe tone color to ensure that you're creating a vivid description. However, be careful not to use character words such as like melancholy or cheerful when you're describing tone color, because they don't actually describe the sound of the instrument. So a quick check to see if you're using a solid tone color word. Ask yourself, if I asked a musician to play with a more cheerful tone, would they know what I mean? Now, Nick, there's some conductors around the world that are renowned for their flowery and vague instructions from the podium. Could you maybe tell us about some of your experiences in this situation?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to name any names because I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but it is quite funny when you get someone up there and you sort of understand it. You know, a conductor, they have to be so deeply in the music and, you know, they live it and they think about it. You know, we all do that a bit, but somehow conductors, they take it to another level, and they'll be conducting some great work and they'll give you this big, long philosophical discussion about what this part of the music represents and how it's meant to make everyone feel. And, you know, you sometimes get that, and then some sort of very experienced oboe player might put their hand up and say, yes, maestro, does that mean you would like that softer? You know, so, you know, and it really is necessary. These conductors sometimes have to distill all this thought down to just 2 or 3 words. Can you play it softer with, you know, a more gentle attack, or, you know, slightly later, or can you just balance that down? And they create this meaning just with all of the music words that are basically, you know, softer, louder, shorter, longer, you know, those kinds of things. It's really important to be able to do that.
Well, it's great to know that the MSO thinks like the VCE examiners, because that's exactly the same information that the VCE examiners want to hear. They want the specifics. And we often find that the most insightful answers explain how the tone color is produced. So influencing factors might include things like the register the instrument is playing in, or the style of articulation that's being used, or the dynamic marking, or any extended techniques. So let's have another listen to Sculthorpe's New Nausea. And while we do, I want you to get on the chat and fill up the chat window with descriptions of tone color, both for the individual instruments that you hear, but also the overall blend. So this is, I can see there's been some great stuff happening in the chat already, but here's a wonderful opportunity for us to learn from each other. So if we could hit play on the track, get into the chat and put your thoughts in there. Well, I guess I'm going to assume everybody's taken a pen and piece of paper and they've been writing down their thoughts about the tone color rather than popping them in the chat window as I asked you to. So feel free to go ahead and use that chat function. But I'm sure I'd be seeing things such as, the trumpets sound resonant and focused and sweet. There's vibrato being used to warm the sound. The tone color is clear and centered or bright. I'm sure I would have read that the blend is homogeneous, and that's achieved with the same style of articulation. They're playing in a comfortable range without force. There's no edge on the front of the note. It's a mezzo forte dynamic, maybe increasing to a really natural forte dynamic, and that's how that beautiful, warm and sweet and focused sound was created. I'm hoping that I would have read that the trombones are a little more mellow than the trumpets, but yet still homogeneous in their approach to tone color. The tuba was maybe a little bit more rumbling or slightly woolly with a slightly less clear attack on the start of the note. And then the brass in that piece are, really quite, as I said, homogeneous and consistent in their approach to tone color. But the contrast that I was talking about really comes through in the percussion. If you listen to the conga has a hollow tone. It's resonant and percussive. And when we say percussive, in that it's a very clear attack to the front of the note and a very fast decay. You could maybe describe the conga as being woody, a little boomy. Now, interestingly, it sounds more mellow at a soft dynamic and more percussive or less sustained at a high pitch when it's played close to the rim. And then there's some really interesting stuff happening with the gong. It's a brash, heavy, harsh sound when it's struck or rolled with mallet, but then a lighter, more metallic sound when it is scraped. So, Nick, while we're talking about tone color, I wonder if you could grab your conveniently located cello once more and maybe run us through some of the different sounds that can be achieved on the cello for us and talk about how we actually create those different sounds.
Sure. Well, let's start with your if someone just puts something on the page and doesn't ask us to do much, we're going to play with what I consider, your standard issue cello sound, which is along the lines of. But then that can go in all sorts of directions. I could play the same thing. If someone wanted it a little bit leaner sounding, we might take out the vibrato. Or perhaps somebody's going to want it to be a bit more mellow and blending and less kind of up front. In which case we'll take the bow and put it over the fingerboard, and that's called sul tasto. See if you can hear the difference. Makes the sound very sort of airy and light. We can go in the other direction with the bow. If we move it towards the bridge, we get ponticello. And you can take that from something that's a little bit edgy to something that's actually falling apart completely. And then, of course, there's pizzicatos. So many things we can do. Your standard pizz. Bartok pizzicato, where we let pull the string straight up and it hits the fingerboard. Sometimes they want us to do left-hand pizzicato, which might be if you're doing bow and pizz quickly. So there's just so many things. This is just one instrument. One instrument by itself can make all these different sounds. So the whole orchestra, it's a lot going on.
A lot of different sounds available, and I can see that there's some awesome references going on to the sound of the tone color in Eunorcia in the chat window, so keep those coming in. And now the other element that I wanted to look at on this piece is phrasing, and I think it can be a little difficult sometimes to nail down exactly what phrasing actually is. And we've all heard things like phrasing is a musical sentence. But what does that mean? It always used to confuse me. So, here's a list of some of the things that you can refer to when discussing phrasing. And Nick, of course, demonstrated a number of these beautifully earlier on. So we want to consider things like how long each phrase is. And then maybe what happens in between the phrases. Are there any silences or what's happening in the accompaniment? Are the phrases in even bar lengths or are they uneven? Maybe there's some 3-bar phrases going on. Where's the natural high point in the phrase and where's the natural resting point? And is there any repetition? You know, for example, it might be like an A-A-B structure going on in the music, but then how does the musician differentiate each of those phrases? And often when we talk about phrasing, we actually want to draw in some different elements and pair them together. So things like, you know, what type of articulation is being used? Or what's the dynamic shape that's being employed by the musicians in the phrasing? That's a really important one. So I guess essentially it all boils down to the degree of importance of each note. And as Nick explained before, whether it's coming from somewhere, it's going to somewhere, or if it's the destination. So let's take one more listen to the MSO brass and percussion playing New Nausea. And this time in the chat, fill it up with sentences describing the phrasing. Awesome. There's some really great chat happening in there, so keep that coming in. But we're going to move on now and have a listen to a remarkable work by Brenton Broadstock. And this is a really great piece for discussing articulation, because the range of sounds is just so amazing. And of course, articulation essentially refers to the beginning, the middle, and the end of a sound, or in musical terms, we call it attack, sustain, and release. And as we touched on earlier, just because something's marked staccato, it doesn't mean you just play it detached. Perhaps the music needs a light staccato with a gentle release, or an abrupt staccato with a sudden decay. Articulation probably has the most significant effect on the sense of style of the piece, but it also impacts on the character significantly also. So there's a number of factors that can affect the articulation, and the examiners love hearing about any instrument-specific techniques. You know, things such as strummed guitar or slap-tongue saxophone, or hard mallets on the glockenspiel, or an aspirate onset of the vocalist. And they also love to think about, you know, the register and the dynamics and how that can affect articulation as well. So as we listen to this piece, And No Birds Sing by Brenton Broadstock, I want everybody to focus their listening on just one instrument at first, and then in the chat, put everything that you notice about the use of articulation for that one instrument. And as we get through the piece, feel free to expand and listen to more than one instrument and add your comments there. Some excellent things coming in on that chat, but you know, when I listened to this, I sort of thought that in this the opening we've heard mostly legato sounds, mostly gentle attacks, long sustain and slow decay. Because remember, in articulation, we're really focusing on attack, sustain, and decay. So there's very few sudden entries or releases in the opening, and I thought that interestingly that really allows the harmonic tension to be sustained, which contributes to that unsettling or uneasy character that's created. And I've noticed a few people have referred to lots of pitch bends going on during the notes. Sometimes it happens at the start, sometimes it happens throughout the note, but also at the end with the upward flute. Like sometimes the release, the pitch actually slides sharp. And I think that creates a sense of harmonic ambiguity and tension, and maybe a sense of delirium, perhaps. It almost sounds like a shakuhachi. So as the piece develops, so we certainly start to get some strong accents, and they happen in unpredictable places, and that creates a sense of unpredictability, surprisingly enough. And I've talked about the scoops and the slurs, but that really blurs the attack of the front of the note sometimes. Likewise, later on, we get some crushed appoggiaturas in the bass clarinet, which also blurs the attack of the front of the note. What else we got? We've got some vibrato happening in there. Now, interestingly, vibrato often can be spoken about as being a tone color word, and sometimes we've got to be careful not to be pulled in from an articulation question to start using vocabulary that has connotations with tone color. But vibrato, because it talks about this, how the note is sustained, can absolutely be something that's addressed in an articulation question. I thought, interestingly, there was prepared piano, which added a percussive edge to the attack and really ended up with a quick decay in the piano. And I noticed a few people spoke about the overblowing in the alto flute, but also the flutter tongue. There was tremolo in the violin, and then the gong, which had it's slightly gradual, like it's a not instantaneous attack, but it's followed by an all-consuming attack, which the sound kind of washes over the top of everything, and that's followed by a really even and moderately slow decay. We had hard mallets in the vibraphone, which created a really clear edge to the front of the note, and a roll on the tom gets a rumbling effect. But later on, once the tempo is established, the articulation becomes more staccato and crisp than we had in the opening, and the use of accents coming in on uncommon groupings, lots of groups of threes or fives and those sorts of things, which creates a bit of a hemiola effect, and that adds to the rhythmic tension and also creates drive in the tempo, because what's happening is it's just these repeated quavers, but we're using different accents to bring out kind of different moments in the music, which creates a bit of a tension or a sense of urgency at that tempo. We definitely get the more staccato across the ensemble. Interestingly, when we're starting to look at a level of insight that if you have time for in your written responses to start and compare the articulation of different instruments, I don't know if you noticed, but there's only one string instrument in there, and they're playing arco on with the bow. And that tends to create a slightly less defined release to the winds. It's a slightly longer release than what the winds were playing with. And of course, the use of stick on the toms creates a really sudden and clear attack. And there's a whole lot more there. And I'm looking forward to go back and reading the chat and see what all of your thoughts were. But let's have a quick look at how rhythm is used to create character in And No Birds Sing. Now, I think it's a really interesting piece to look at rhythm, and probably not something that would be the usual type of excerpt you might have been asked to discuss rhythm on. There's a number of aspects to rhythm, and which can introduce and include things like meter and tempo. But in a nutshell, it's really essentially describing the subdivision within the pulse, the types of rhythm you hear, any patterns or contrast in the use of rhythm, and any specific devices such as ostinato, hemiola, or syncopation. So let's have one more listen here, and get your fingers typing in the chat window, and let's have a bit of a conversation about rhythm. Excellent. I can see some really great things starting to come in. Some people are referring to the fact that it's quite ambiguous in the opening, and there's not really any a clear sense of pulse, and that's created by having long sustained notes and then short little flurries of movement and a slow tempo, and effects such as tremolo and glissandi and complex rhythmic values and the use of irregular accents. All of those things combine to really break down the sense of pulse and any sense of rhythmic rhythmic unity that's happening through that opening. And of course, when we're speaking about any element, it's important to identify what's actually going on in the music, but then that level of insight comes from explaining how that is created. So things such as, sustained sounds or use of lots of rubato, tremolo and glissandi, they're going to be the sorts of things that create that sense of ambiguity in the pulse. But later on, the flute starts to sound the most rhythmically secure, especially in its cadenza. And whilst it doesn't really establish a clear sense of pulse during that cadenza, it does start to facilitate the transition into the establishment of a clear pulse. And that's then realized by the clarinet and the piano in unison. And I was heartened to see that a couple of people have mentioned that in the chat. But then we start to get these repeating melodic figures with that undercurrent of quavers. And as I mentioned earlier, they're often grouped in odd numbers, which creates a sense of hemiola at times. Now, unfortunately, in our 90-minute session tonight, we don't really have time to go through all of the elements that you're going to come across in an end-of-year exam, things such as dynamics and texture and harmony, melody or structure. But at the end of the day, all you need to remember is that you have to read the question carefully, stay on the topic of the question, and use musically appropriate vocabulary to discuss specific examples in the music and how the elements are used to create character. So, of course, in styles and composition, for anybody out there who's undertaking that study design, you probably need to dig a little bit deeper and discuss how the piece is constructed and how the thing's put together. So, however, we're not going to leave you empty-handed. There's a number of ideas on how you can continue to develop your analysis skills on the MSO website. So you can go and check out some resources I've put together to help you revise for your exams. But there's also two particularly brilliant resources that I encourage everybody to go and check out. The first one is Listening Beyond Hearing. It's a website which has heaps of resources that are free for you to go and check out. And then there's a book called Listening Beyond Hearing, which is written by the incredible Jenny Gillen. And it's a really, really, really great summation of everything that you really need to know about analysis for VCE music performance and also styles and composition. So Listening Beyond Hearing by Jenny Gillen. And the other one you should definitely go and check out is called Decoding Sound. And that's by Deb Smith. And you can probably check that out on her website. But before we close, I thought that we might just take a quick little moment here. And I want everybody to stop and think about the best exam preparation or advice or resources that you've been given by your teacher, or maybe like a student who's been through the VC exams before or something like that. And let's just put together a big chat bomb of the best advice you've received about preparing for exams from either a teacher or a friend or a peer, and just put those together so there's a really great opportunity for everybody to benefit from that great advice and those resources. But we'll get to having a look at that a little bit later on. And Sylvia, I think we've got a little bit of time for a couple of questions. I can see that there are a couple of questions that popped up in the chat.
Thanks, James. Yes, we do. We just have a couple, and I encourage everyone to make the most of this opportunity. You've got an amazing couple of presenters here who have a lot of experience. But let's start with the first one. The first question says, how do I refer to a particular string or brass instrument when they sound blended together? Have you got any hacks for that, James?
Any hacks? Sometimes it can be really hard to hear when things sound so similar exactly which instruments you're actually hearing in a piece of music. And sometimes, particularly in like world music, you might not know what that instrument is called, but you might know what family it comes from. It might be an aerophone, for example, or you could say, the chordophone, or the strummed instrument, or the flute-like instrument. Anything that just shows the examiner what it is that you're actually listening to, then that can be a really kind of great step towards what it is. And sometimes you might not be really sure, and it's not a bad idea to sort of hedge your bet just a little bit on exactly what it is that you're listening for. But when you're trying to describe those different sounds, sometimes you might be able to identify that there's a higher pitched instrument or an instrument in the middle or a lower pitched instrument. And sometimes you'll find that there's like a really subtle nuance in the sound. And if you can identify what those nuances are, that's the level of insight that the examiners really, really love to be able to see in what you're hearing.
Lovely. Thanks, James. I've got another question here, and I noticed that the chat wasn't as lively when we were talking about phrasing. So I wonder if it's worth spending a bit of time. How do you know when a phrase ends? Can we talk about that a little bit more?
Okay, I can talk about that, but maybe Nick, how do you know when a phrase ends? I've got some ideas, but we'll go to the professional first.
I saw that question. I went, oh, how do you know when a phrase ends? It's a really, really good question, because we're sort of really starting to get out of the area of, technical stuff and science into, it's uncharted waters at this point. It depends on, obviously, there are styles of music where it's more obvious. And I think that came up because we're looking at phrasing in relation to new nausea, right? And so I think there's a technique that Sculthorpe uses. There's a lot of overlapping phrases. I think that's what I feel like. I don't know that piece particularly well, but I'm getting the feeling like, there's a trumpet phrase, but there's some other phrase that crosses over that. So how do you know when a phrase ends? You just have to use your instinct. You can often, most of the time there'll be, a phrase has a shape and it comes to some sort of a slight pause or a little rest or a breath or something like that. You really just have to use your instinct for that one. It's a matter of experience. There's no really clear answer to that. Unless, of course, talking about really simple classical music, like the opening of Eine kleine Nachtmusik. It's exactly 8 bars long. It's a 4-bar it's an 8-bar symmetrical phrase, 4 bars, 4 bars. You can't argue about where that starts or finishes. But even by the time we get to Brahms, do you look at a phrase that goes over 2 bars, over 4 bars, over 16 bars, that kind of thing. And again, that's where your interpretation comes into play.
I think listening to lots of music is really important for that, because one of the things that you're going to have at the end of year is you could have anything from Bulgarian wedding music to an Irish jig to an Australian kind of rock classic, although if it's meant to be unheard, they're probably not going to go with something local. But you can hear all sorts of different sounds. And despite the fact that it's got to be an Australian music, like Australian music is so diverse, it really could actually be anything. So listening to a really broad range of music is super, super important. I think when we're talking about phrasing, Nick touched on it, often at the end of a phrase, there's some sort of rest point. Generally, there's some sort of resting point in the melodic sound, or it might be a harmonic cadence. If you kind of think about, the cello suites by Bach, that just, you look at the page and it's a whole bunch of notes and it doesn't really look like it stops at all, but it really does. There are really clear phrases in there, even though it just looks like a page full of semiquavers. So being able to understand and hear the harmonic structure can often tell you where the end point of a phrase occurs, but also where there is that sense of breath, or where there's a long note, sustained note is often the resting point. But within that, of course, and Nick touched on this, there are different ways to kind of to think about a phrase being constructed. Is it 2 2-bar phrases, or is it 1 4-bar phrase, or is it 2 kind of micro phrases that actually leads to that bigger picture 4-bar phrase? So I think I would encourage you not to get too kind of hung up with knowing exactly when it finishes, but if you can kind of have a general idea about and know that the fact that there's gray area in the discussion of phrasing, and just write what you hear, I think you'll be fine. And of course, that example of New Nausea does really have some long phrases that feel like they never stop, and they sort of overlap with each other. And that would be a really great thing to be writing about if you had an excerpt such as that in the end of your exam.
Great. Thanks, James. We've got one more question here. The question is, what's the best way to structure an answer when comparing elements?
And of course, this is a VCE music performance question where we have to compare maybe 2 different versions of the one piece of music, or maybe it's something where you're trying to compare the opening section of a piece with the contrasting B section of the piece. And I think the best way to go about that is a table. just like a tea table. So you put a line straight down the middle of the page, and you're going to talk about example A over here. Maybe you're talking about tone color, and here's everything that I want to say about what's happening in the introduction about tone color. And over here is everything that I want to say about the B section with the use of tone color. What's really, really important, though, is that you compare like for like. So you kind of can't be talking about, oh yeah, the trumpet tone color is this, and then over here you're talking about, the tom-tom tone color. What's really great is if you can refer to the tone color, if it's a comparison of like different characters, how does the trumpet sound here? How does the trumpet sound over here? Unless, of course, you are actually trying to talk about the contrast of different tone colors of different instruments in that table. But in general, I'm a big fan of dot points rather than steering away from prose and writing pages and pages and pages and pages and pages, big long paragraphs. Put a dot point, make your point. And of course, always make sure that you make it really clear which element you're actually talking about. Sometimes I think we're so quick to actually jump to the information that we don't make it easy on the examiners to know what it is that we're actually talking about. So I hope that kind of helps.
That does. And in the process, you've actually answered the last question we had. Would you recommend dot points or paragraphs? But dot points is the way to go.
I think so. I think that you don't have a lot of time. And that it generally, my experience is that it helps people put their point across more clearly, not necessarily in what you're writing, but just in trying to interpret it as an examiner, just being able to read exactly and get to the crux of the point really efficiently. Please don't be one of those students who rewrites the examiner's question for us. Just get into answering it. We know what the question is. You can just jump straight in and get your ideas on the page. I'm personally a big brainstormer. Like when I'm hearing things for the first time, I just like to write down what it is that I'm hearing. Maybe it's a question about a particular element, and I'm just going to just jot down all of the things that I'm hearing about that element, and then I try to pull them together into certain dot points. Other people are amazing where they can just jump in and start writing and make coherent sense. That's not me. I have to brainstorm first and then kind of work out what I can pair together. And I find that actually gets me a much more efficient response by the time, it's pens down at the end of the exam.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. That's really helpful, I'm sure. Well, we've come to the end of tonight pretty much. I want to say a huge thank you to Nick and James for this really helpful and eye-opening presentation. To have the expertise from an educator and musician perspective is really quite unique and not something that everyone will have access to. So I hope you enjoyed it and were able to make the most of it. Of course, hearing the wonderful MSO also illustrating the musical points is an amazing asset. I'm sure you'll agree. If you haven't yet done so, we do encourage you to explore the MSO Classroom Live Online page on the website. As James mentioned, you'll be able to explore the resources he's created to help you in your preparation beyond tonight's webinar. I'm also really excited to let you know that our next session is on in the second week of Term 4 on Monday, the 12th of October at 6:30 p.m. And in that one, we'll dive deeply into Stravinsky's Rite of Spring with Nick and Katie McCune, who's an educator and former dancer. She's also the head of education and outreach at the Australian Ballet. So all information for that session is available on our website, and we do hope we'll see you there. Now, we have one final question that's coming up on the screen for you. For those of you who'd like to do just a little bit more exam prep, to do this, we're going to play for you one more piece called Januaries by a Sydney composer called Lisa Ilian to finish off our session. So thanks again for coming, everyone, and good night, and stick around for a little bit more prep.